What's good, everybody? My guest today is Roderick Jefferson, CEO of Roderick Jefferson and Associates, who quite literally coined the phrase sales enablement, which I will ask him about shortly. He's also the creator of Sales Enablement System and author of the best-selling book, Sales Enablement 3.0. Previously, he worked for such companies as Netscope, Marketo, Oracle Marketing Cloud, Salesforce, NetApp, PayPal, AT&T, and others. Perhaps you've heard of those companies. Roderick, welcome to the Goats of Growth.
I am honored, man. Thanks for having me on, Jay. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And a quick shout out to Mark Magnaca, co-founder and president of Lego, for making this introduction. Mark, I really appreciate you. Thank you for putting such an awesome person in my life, for sure.
Thank you. Shout out to Mark. Absolutely.
That's right. So Roderick, talk to me a little bit about what you're doing currently now and how you help companies with sales enablement and all things attached to that.
Sure. So I am running a company called Roderick Jefferson and Associates. We really focus on that mid-size to enterprise level. And the goal is really about how do we get them to accelerate speed to revenue, increase productivity, ultimately maintaining the customers that they have today. So I think the best way I can describe it is it's not your typical consulting, right? We go beyond just the foundational sales and services consulting. We take an overall comprehensive look of what's going on across the entire buyer's journey, hiring practices, tools, methodology, coaching, and the enablement processes. And then we take all of that knowledge, turn it into a customized solution that meets the unique needs of a given customer. And then we kind of tie all of the revenue focused metrics together with that to make sure that everything is a nice, tight package. It's iterative, you're constantly growing, and it's not something we give to you one time as kind of, a quick sprint. It is literally a marathon where we become a partner with a given company.
Tell me about, I alluded to, I wanted to ask you about it, sales enablement. Where did that come from? Just give me the situation, the time, because I'm sure people will be curious. They're like, wait a minute, I thought sales enablement was just something that existed always. Like, what do you mean this guy created it? Coined that phrase. Tell me about that.
It's funny. It's been around for a while now, right? And to me, the genesis was a conversation that I had with my VP of sales back when I was at NetApp. Here's how the story went. I'm talking to him and he's saying, you know what, it's taking too long to get folks ramped up and getting, kind of speed to revenue. Throw training at it. Oh, okay, sure. Also, we've got a problem handling discovery and qualification. Throw training at it. We're discounting too deeply because people can't handle objections. Throw training at it. We've got a bunch of managers, but I wouldn't call them leaders. Guess what he said? Throw training at it. So in the spur of the moment, and I'll be honest, being a smartass, which I've been known to be once or twice over the years, I said, actually, you train animals, you enable people. And from there, a light bulb went on. He said, you know what? Explain to me what this enablement thing is. And to me, the way I explain it is enablement is more of a marathon, whereas training is kind of a sprint. And let me explain what I mean. Enablement goes all the way back to the talent acquisition and assessment piece. We should literally be a part of the interview process. One, we understand what it takes and the propensity to be successful in a given company. Secondly, we've got a process in place. We need to make sure we're hiring the right kind of people. And thirdly, our BS filter is a lot higher because we deal with sales folks all the time, right? And then it goes into the onboarding piece. And when I'm talking about onboarding, both generally from a cohort perspective, and there's a time to bring everyone together so you can understand the roles and the value of each of those roles across the buyer's journey and also in regards to closing sales. But then there's also another piece where you've got to break them out because as we know, talking to a BDR, an SE, a CSM, or a sales leader is a completely different conversation in each piece. And now everybody wants to talk about the onboarding and the new shiny toys and the new folks. What about the legacy folks that have been around for a while? What are we doing from a business acumen perspective of constantly sharpening the sword to make sure that we are keeping those people abreast of what's happening in the changes in the competitive landscape, what's happening around the mergers and acquisitions. What happens when you're going to, and I mean before, not after, but before you're going to release a new product. So that means tying all of the internal roles and lines of business together, the marketing, the product marketing, the HR, the engineering. The next piece is that piece that gets left out so often, and that's coaching and reinforcement, but not for your individual contributors, for your leaders. So often we assume that they are going to take that upon themselves, which they rarely do. What they do is they lean on what they know or what they learn from their peers. So how are we going to make sure that they're constantly sharpening the sword and growing so that they can increase both their IQ and their EQ and be able to pass that on to their team? The next piece is measurements. And I'm talking about true hardline revenue focused metrics, not what we call smiley sheets and butts and seats. We've got, 500 people and it's a 4.8 out of 5. No one cares about that anymore. That and $7 will get you a latte. The last piece is around building out succession planning. What are we doing for folks to, one, create more managers? And that does not mean you take your rock star seller and you turn him into a sales leader. That actually creates two problems. One, I now have an open patch where I had a rock star. And secondly, I've got someone that's only managed a patch. They've never hired, fired. They've never interviewed. They've never run a team meeting. So let's, along the way, make sure that we're getting these people prepared and getting them to that next level. Now, that's that marathon that I'm referring to that we call sales enablement. It's tools, it's processes, it's programs, it's platforms. Ultimately, it's about making people bigger, faster, and stronger.
Yeah, and obviously it's a marathon that never ends as well, though, right? Marathon.
Oh yeah, that's the everboarding piece, right?
Yeah.
That is a continual, constant process, because once that stops, guess what happens? You instantly start to regress.
You said something that is near and dear to my heart, frankly, and my business, which is aligning sales enablement with a hiring process. And I remember one of the things that you had mentioned when we talked initially is the ICP, right? Ideal candidate profile. Why isn't that happening more often? Listen, I've been doing this for 16 plus years. Sales enablement is nowhere near the interview process.
I think the reason is most of the time, well, first, let me start back. There's not a clear definition that is universally owned around what enablement does and what the value of it is. I think that's a good and a bad thing. On the good side, it's constantly growing and evolving, and it's really dependent upon where the company is in their maturation cycle. The downside is, how do I now validate what we're doing, and how do we now put a value on that piece? Now, to answer your question, why they're not part of the interview cycle, too often we're seen as just really high-paid training, or they equate us with learning and development. Now, we're a partner to L&D, but L&D to me is what is being pushed out broadly. Enablement is literally what's being pulled in so that it can now be shared broadly across a given enterprise. I think the more you do that, the more we now become a higher value across the organization. And then we become woven into the fabric of a company and a culture.
So it sounds to me like basically what you just said, being pulled in by, say, people leaders, if you will, or other function areas is really where it should be evolving if it hasn't already.
Oh, absolutely. We are not sales scribes. We're not sales support, and we're not sales doormats. We literally need to be a partner across all of the lines of business. Let me give you an example. As an enablement person, I am now talking not only to sales folks, but I'm also listening in on calls. And if you're doing this properly, you're actually going out and talking to customers as well, because I think there's a high amount of value that comes out of that. I come back from that and I go to product marketing and go, you know what? I've heard our first call pitched 10 times, messaged and positioned 8 different ways. Why don't we put an accreditation in place, or a stand and deliver, not a certification, but a true accreditation, to make sure that everybody is speaking the same language? We're not confusing our prospects out in sales land, right? Mm-hmm. I go to product management. I say, you know what? I know we're coming up on a new release, but I've heard this same request 5 times. How do we get this bumped up on the release cycle, right? Then I go into HR and I say, you know what? I need to sit down with you in sales, because marketing and product marketing has done a fantastic job of outlining what our ICP is, our ideal client profile. But what about our IEP, which is our ideal employee profile? What happens when your seller profile changes? Your company grows, and in each maturation cycle, you need a different type of seller. And also you need to make some tweaks as to your messaging and positioning, the competitive landscape shifts, all that stuff. So the more we can do that, the more we become a true partner across lines of business versus being seen as either a cost center or, God forbid, the fixers of broken things and broken people. I think IT's got that worked out. I'm gonna let them have that.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And by the way, for context, as it pertains to the phrase sales enablement, you were at NetApp between 2004 and 2006. So in terms of the timing of when that started to become part of or at least when you coined it, I don't know exactly.
Yeah, it became nomenclature, I think, consistently.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, and then you look at something like the Sales Enablement Society. They've done a fantastic job. Sales Enablement Pro, Enablement Squad, Trust Enablement, a number of groups have come together now. And what we're trying to do is really build some consistency. Because as I said earlier, we want consistency in nomenclature. We want consistency in processes, in tools, in metrics, all those things, so that when you go from company A to company B, you're not starting all over again. Mm-hmm. And also, I think that will help us being enablement practitioners, and also for our sales leaders now I want to talk to for a moment, to clearly understand how to partner with enablement versus how do I use enablement in my sales strategy.
Well, let's go deeper into that.
Sure.
And maybe even, let's focus on the pillars that we started with, which was accelerate speed to revenue, increase productivity per head, and tie it to the front and the back together. So how should sales leaders hold sales enablement in? And let's start with that first one, accelerate speed to revenue. Give me an example of both, how they should go about it and what that actually looks like when it's working effectively so that you are getting to revenue quickly.
Sure. First of all, it's about getting together and agreeing upon what is the ultimate goal of a new hire. Now we've figured out what our IEP and all that is, right? So what is it? When you come out of boot camp, we want them to be able to do what? And that is message and positioning, right? They understand the tool stack. They understand how to manage their patch. They understand what the expectation is. It's a given that they'll understand what the quota is, but how do you get to it, right? So that means we start building out what's called guided learning paths. And that is, what do we want them to do first? And think about it as kind of building a house, if you will, Jay, right? We're going to help them to build the foundation and the slab. And that's going to give them the messaging, the positioning, the competitive landscape, all those things. And we'll get that in place. Then when you move up from there, working specifically with that first and second line manager, right? And that is now divvying up who owns what, who defines what, and then who owns the adoption. Let me tell you that. On the front end, what I've done is sat down with those first line managers and said, I know you've already got a process. I've got a process. What can we do to kind of meld those together so that we're both speaking the same language and we're kind of singing from the same hymn, if you will, right? Then I say, what I need you to do, Mr. and Mrs. First or second line manager, is to own the adoption, the execution, but most importantly, the positive modeling of this. Because if I'm out here and my team is teaching one way, or I'm teaching one way, and you say, oh, don't worry about Salesforce, we're still going to do forecasts this way, we're counterproductive. We have to be in lockstep. And then on the back end of that, I come back in and my team comes in to say, we've put all these things in now. It used to take, I'll give you a real life example. One company, I walked in, time to first close was 82 days in the SMB space. 2.5 years later, by the time I left, we had dropped that down to 54 days. Now think about this, a 33% accelerate to ramp to speed. Also, now I could go back and say the average order value in this SMB space is X amount. We've picked up, let's call it 2 months, times the number of folks that we have brought aboard. Here's the true influence and impact, because we don't drive revenue, but the true impact and influence that we've had on overall revenue. Now you're no longer talking about how many people went to your workshop, how many people were a 4.0, who thinks you're wonderful and you're lovely. No, you're saying, here's how we've truly impacted X amount of millions worth of dollars.
You mentioned accreditation versus certification before. Help me understand what the
Sure. Thanks. First of all, that's a great question. Certification is a legal term. It is something that literally has a substance or a meaning outside of the walls of your company. Microsoft, MCMC, that's a certification, right? When you're certifying your partners on your stack, technically, that's a certification. Accreditation is literally a stand and deliver process to ensure that everyone can consistently message in position, is really what it comes down to.
And stand and deliver, what do you mean by that?
Okay, let me give you the process of a typical accreditation. I'll work with the sales leaders. We'll build this out. We'll work with marketing. We'll go and find kind of the best of whether it be discovering qualification or objection handling, whatever it may be. Yep. Then what we'll do is we'll create what I'll call a gold star recording of it, right? And now there's an example for everybody else to do it. Now, I start always again with that first and second line manager. Let's accreditate them first and have them do it with me and my team so that now they set that example, because what's important to my manager is imperative to me if I'm a seller. Now we roll down, and that manager is now responsible for having their team record that first call pitch, if you will. They now are responsible for going in and reviewing those, as well as providing feedback and review. We build out a standardized scorecard to make sure that it's consistent, right? But the manager literally has some, let's call it skin in the game, of making sure that their people can message in position correctly.
Got it. And yeah. Thank you for that. And going back to something you said earlier about the managers and reinforcing, or first and second line managers ultimately reinforcing the process, if you will, what sales enablement is putting in place. How often is that not the case? And then how do you fix that?
I don't want to make it sound like it's the easiest thing in the world. It isn't. And it really depends on one thing. What makes it easier is if I'm working with a leader and we can have a conversation around the why we're doing things. And then on the back end, how I can help their lives actually be easier. What if I could get your people up to, and let's give a sports analogy, I can get your people up to the 30-yard line or to the red zone. What I need you to do now is take them from the red zone into the end zone. And that happens from you reinforcing the things that me and my team are rolling out as far as initiatives and processes and programs. And it's also you validating that this is the right thing. And the most important part of all this, Jay, is I need them to constantly reinforce to their teams that this was built with sales, not around sales, and not for sales. I'm not giving you what you think they need. Really, I've asked you what you need. We built this together. Now I need you to stand on it and own the piece of reinforcing it with your team, and also putting in place the actual practical application of it.
It sounds to me like what you just said there is really the thing. In other words, and frankly, I guess it's no different from an external customer, right? Where you're building it together. In other words, you're coming together with,
absolutely,
because then you have it's almost like intrinsic buy-in, right? In other words, they've created it with you.
It's a partnership.
Yeah, it's a partnership.
Right? And now you can't say, oh, we're not going to do this. Wait, you helped me build this. Right. Actually, this is the piece that you infused into the process. So now I expect you to own that piece around the adoption, the execution, and the positive modeling of it. Because if you do it, your teams are going to do it. If you don't do it, they have no reason to follow in place. And then it just becomes kind of a sales enablement initiative, and that thing will die on the vine.
So, all right. So let me ask you this then. Because frontline managers often have, they have the carrot and the stick, right? In order to sort of
absolutely
manage their teams, and they have, one-on-ones and various reporting structures and all that stuff. And to sort of, let's say, motivate behavior. In your role, how do you enable what we just talked about? Enable, right? But like, how do you reinforce it, right? Because you might have, let's say you built an enablement program of sales forecasting model, all that stuff together with the sales leader, right? And to me, based on what you just said, it's sort of like a one-off thing where it's like, okay, we built this, go do it, and I'll check in with you every once in a while. But how do you actually make sure that that's an ongoing thing where they are adopting it?
It's a great question. There's a couple of things.
Yeah.
One is I always work through the sales leader. I'm not sending out communications to their people. I may ghostwrite it and give it to them because, again, you see this come across from your boss or your boss's boss. Guess what you're going to do? You're going to pay attention to it. You're going to read it. You're going to now follow in line with it. It's different if you're coming from enablement. You're like, yeah, I know that's important, but it's probably like 10th thing on my list. Comes from your manager. Guess what it did? It just floated up to the top. That's one. Let's go back to that accreditation thing for a moment. There's another thing that I've done, and that is we do those accreditations on a weekly basis. We pull reports and we send it out broadly, and I mean publicly, of who has completed, what percentage they've completed, who has not started, who has not completed. You know what that becomes? It becomes a wall of fame or a wall of shame, depending upon that given, and it's by manager. And I send it up to the sales leader and I send it out to all of the sales leaders so their peers see where everybody is. I guarantee you that there's been very few times that the same person has been on the low end of the totem pole 2 weeks in a row, because no leader wants to be on the bottom of any list.
Right.
So then what I let that do is I let them determine whether or not this will be a wall of fame or it'll be a wall of shame. And either way, we're going to get to that point. But that's just half of it, because that's just about, carrot and stick. For me, it's less about that piece. It's really about we have built and we've agreed that this is going to have a positive, immediate, or at least short-term impact on revenue. Let's do this thing together, right? I don't want to go out and have my team or myself build things out that's going to be shelfware. So let's work together and you tell me, how can I help you to accelerate that speed to revenue? Where are the pains that you're having? Or I go back and say, you know what? Taking a look at the forecasting piece, and I've noticed that we're getting stuck between stage 2 and stage 3. Now, let's talk together about why this is, and I've got some back end on that piece of how it happened and why. Now, here's what I think we can do to get over that hump. And maybe it's because people aren't doing enough deep level of discovering qualification. Let's do a disco and qual workshop, right? Let's do some mocks so that they can work on this piece. Maybe they just aren't getting enough at-bats at this, or when I get there, maybe they're getting stuck by questions that are being asked, so it's slowing down the deal velocity. That's what enablement does also. We find those soft spots and we go, let's go fill them in.
Is that a push or a pull? In other words, are you sort of pushing it out there instead of saying both? Well, but what's the reality of most of the time, though, right? Because I feel like sometimes I feel like the 80-20 will always sort of be there. In other words, either you're proactively looking at the data, I don't know whether it's every day, every week, and then you're going to the manager and you're saying, or managers, and you're saying, hey, I've noticed things are slowing down between stage 2 and stage 3, or are they going to you and saying, hey, Rod, like, what do we do here? Like, things are slowing down.
It really depends on the leader and the kind of relationship you have. I've had some leaders that have come proactively. Others, it's like pulling teeth sometimes. Yeah. But you know what? People lie. Metrics don't. So I go in and I never say, here's what I think or here's what I feel. I killed that a long time ago. What I come in and I say is, let me show you what the data is saying. And here's where the problems are. And here's how we can help to alleviate that pain, or how we can accelerate, productivity and efficiency. And here's what your people are going to get to. And I notice I always talk about the why. Because too many times we talk about what we need to do, people tune out. If I tell you why and what the outcomes are going to be, and if I can show you definitively by data and by metrics, you can't argue. You can argue with numbers. You cannot argue, with metrics.
And I'm imagining now, because we're just literally talking about one small piece of the pie.
Oh, absolutely.
In terms of what you're doing, right? But we talked about working with products, working with success, working with HR, working with the CEO, working with all stakeholders and functions across an organization. I would imagine from an individual perspective that not only can that get busy and overwhelming for a human brain to focus on all of those things, but then also as a result of that overwhelm and just frankly the sheer volume of data that you have to be thinking about, that productivity and efficiency can be hurt across all of those functions that I just mentioned. Are there tools that you use in terms of that alert you, let's just say, for instance, that says that maybe something is slowing down between stages, or maybe there's a productivity dip or a misalignment, even so on the people side? Like, just give me a sense of how you're actually operating.
There are a number of things. One is, looking at, because I'm generally on the forecast calls. Let's say I keep hearing the same things over and over around deals and they're stagnating. That's clue to me. Go back, take a look at Salesforce and find out where these things are sitting and how long has it been sitting. Work with sales ops to pull up a report of what are the longest stretches between each of the stages, and go back and let's go back and talk to the sales leader about the root cause of this. Again, the why. The other piece is, because I'm talking with each of those lines of business on an ongoing basis, we begin to build a unified front. And now we can collectively go back to sales and say, you know what, here's a problem that we're all seeing. This part is owned by marketing, product marketing, HR, engineering, etc. And if we do this all together with you included, guess what happens? We start to smooth out the bumps. And again, going back with those metrics and those measurements and that data, stay away from I think this and I feel that.
Yeah.
Even the crabbiest of, the old school salty dog sales leader can't argue with metrics and data.
Right. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier was that the buyers often, change the way they behave, the way they, and then as a result of that, you need to stay on top of that in terms of the messaging, in terms of the IEP, in terms of all of those things, right? Because the sellers need to get stronger in certain areas. How often are you, and how do you stay on top of that in terms of what the buyers, whether that be their personas, their behaviors, all that stuff? How often do you? Buyer's
journey?
Yeah, exactly. Buyer's journey.
I'm having those conversations all the time because they are closer to the ground than I am. They being the sellers and even the leaders. So now that gives me an opportunity to say, hey, this is what is going on out in the real world. Hey, this has just been acquired. Okay, I need to get together with product marketing. I need to get to the competitive intel group, and we need to put together some information to get it out. The other piece is making sure that you never forget adult learning theory. And that is, not everybody learns the same way. So you give it to them over and over, but in a bunch of different delivery vehicles. It may be a podcast. It may be a webinar. It may be a white paper. It may be a competitive brief. Put all that out there in a single location so that they can determine and use the content the way that fits best for them and the way that they choose to consume. The other piece is, we used to have these long, drawn out kind of talking head over PowerPoints. Cut them down to what I call knowledge bites. And that is a quick 3 or so minutes max. And it talks about 3 things: competitive advantage, key differentiation, and business value, right? And most sellers can talk about those first 2 ad nauseum. But honestly, it's that third one that really matters to the buyer. And I define business value as, so Mr. and Mrs. Customer, this is something that you can only get by having a relationship with my company that can either A, help you increase productivity and efficiency, or B, decrease pain. And the third piece is having that conversation. We all say, oh, we want to make sure we're creating champions and we want a champion inside this. You know how we do it that we generally aren't doing? Ask them a simple question. I've done all my homework. I now understand what's happening from a company perspective. What's in it for you personally? How can I help you either get a bigger seat at the table, a louder voice, maybe get you out of the doghouse, or put your name up in lights? But we leave that out, which means we're only talking about half of the equation.
Yeah, so the business value ultimately equates to their personal value as well.
Absolutely. That is a portion of it, certainly.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
And stop digging for pain, because it may not be about pain. It might be about how do you increase productivity and efficiency.
Yep.
So ask those questions. Don't assume.
Once you get the information, from the sellers about certain patterns that they're seeing, how often are you then making those changes, right? Adapting the messaging and business model and all those things to fit what the buyer experience is.
Ongoing. It's an iterative process. Think about even new hires, right? When you're bringing folks in, what we did a month ago or 2 months ago may not even be the same. So after that's all done, we're doing all of our surveys and such. We take that feedback and we start, if we hear it in mass and repetitively, we may pull a module out. We may completely change the module. We go back and work with that presenter and go, from what we're hearing out here, this is completely different. So it is an ongoing iterative process.
And it's hard to say. I feel like I ask this a lot because I'm just curious. It's an ongoing process. It's iterative, which I get, but there really isn't. And you mentioned en masse, right? What is that? Like, how much data, I guess, do you need, though? Right? In other words, because what if you're making a change too prematurely? Like what? Like, you know what I mean? Like, how do you know to say?
I see where you're going. I see where you're going. So what we do is in my programs, I've always done a daily survey and an overall survey, right? And that overall is, what do I wish I would have gotten? And what are the top things that I find most important that I can go put into practical application right now? It's that latter piece that says, here's what I wish I would have done. You know what we do before we make any change? Go and sit down with the sales leaders and go, hey, guys, here's what's brought back to us. Before we go start making these wholesale substitutions, was this an anomaly? Is that just something that's weird going on and it's a blip out on the street right now? Or do we need to do this differently? Then here's what we do. Not only do you stop at the end of the workshop, 30 days, 90 days after, there's another survey. Now that you've had a chance to go put this into practical application, 30 or 90 days ongoing, we get that back and go, aha, and we need to change this module altogether. Or pull that out because it's not as important. Or, things have changed internationally with GDPR. We got to get this out right now. Otherwise, we're exposed. And then we also work with HRL&D and say, you know what? We're hearing some things that they're coming out of the company orientation that they're missing because they're telling us this, right? Hey, you may want to talk about this. And then we have an opportunity to make sure. A lot of companies, you go to orientation, stop. Now you get handed off to enablement for sales training or sales enablement. What if we could co-join those things so that it feels more like a smooth handoff than two completely separated pieces? So we're literally the hub that spokes out to every part of the organization.
And what about change management? In other words,
that entire process is about change management, right? Let me give you a different example. Every month we go and we pull a report from our content management system. I go back to marketing and product marketing and go, here is the top 30 or 50 arbitrary number, right? Let's say top 50 of the most times these have been viewed, the most times it's been downloaded, and the most time that it's been sent out and opened. We can see all of that in our metrics. We also see the bottom 50. Now I go back to them and go, let's talk about a sunset process. No one's using this stuff. Why do we have all this garbage still inside of the system? Pull it out. Talk about change management. From end to end, this is happening, right? And that's why you're constantly having those conversations from two angles. And here's where the change management piece starts. Bottom down from leadership, but also bottom up from the sellers or maybe CSMs, et cetera. I guarantee you, where's the biggest problem? It's the delta between what leadership wants them doing and what really happens in the real world. That's where we focus, is that delta.
Yeah, yep, that makes sense. That makes sense. What about the role that technology plays, and and how often do you rely on that? And frankly, how often do you feel that the technology that you're using or the tech stack is insufficient? In other words, you're like, we need more, we need something else to help us do X.
Yeah. Well, what we're talking about is what I call demystifying the darkness, right? And it's how do we align all of the technology resources that's inside the tech stack? One, are they actually using, they being the end user, are they using it? Again, running reports, we get data. Secondly, where are they being used along the buyer's journey and across all of the sales stages, sales process, sales methodology, et cetera, right? Then the other piece is, what kind of feedback are we getting back from the users? Does this make you more proficient and more efficient, or are these things that are just kind of in your way? And the final piece is, do we have a bunch of shiny tools just because they were kind of the hottest and the sexiest thing right now, and so no one's using it? Get rid of them or shelve them. Because I only want to give you things that are going to make you bigger, faster, and stronger as either a leader or a seller, or I'll just say go to market closer, because it's not just sales, right? You're talking about renewals, upsells, cross sells, all that. So on an ongoing basis, and I would say on a biannual basis, twice a year, really take a deep dive on your tech stack. But on a quarterly basis, run those reports, and then not just what's being used, but what kind of impact is it literally having on deal velocity, the number of closed deals? Are we increasing the average order value? Those kind of things that you can go back again with that data and talk to your leaders and say, we're looking at transitioning from or sunsetting or however you want to position it. But here's the why behind we're doing to do that. Even if it's, you know what, maybe in the UK, they're using one type of prospecting or reporting tool, and maybe it's completely different here. And that's okay if it works well for that given region or that theater. But that you need to have a consistent tool stack, but there can be a variation of which of those type of tools you're using.
Right. And I would imagine that, one of the problems I think with technology, in some cases, technology to humans, is the adoption piece, right? In other words, there could be tools in a particular tech stack that would be really helpful and efficient in improving, all individuals, but people aren't necessarily using them or using them in the way that's effective. So if you're looking at the data, you're looking at the numbers, and you're seeing a low adoption in a particular tool that, let's say, for instance, you have experience with, and you know that it's been successful in the past. First of all, how early do you pick up on that and say, okay, like this is not being adopted, it's not being used? And then how do you increase adoption? I know that's a selling problem too, as well, right? On the seller side.
And that's the whole thing. It may not even be about enablement at all. Yeah. It may just be that, again, that leader doesn't believe in or reinforce or use that tool themselves, right? So if you're not using it, your people definitely aren't. So it's about going back and finding that root cause. And to answer your question, what's the time frame? It depends upon the tool. Some things take a little longer to kind of catch on, and others you should be able to tell much faster than others. But again, don't always assume that it's an enablement or it's a training thing. It could be a cultural thing. It could be leadership. It could be that the seller has chosen not to do it and they're not being pushed to, or it could be bad hires. So you got to look at all of these different variables and kind of balance them out and go, all right, so Mr. and Mrs. Customer, or leader, or go all the way up to the top of the food chain, whether it be the VP or the CRO, and go, we've got now the reports that say this entire team never logs in. The last time they logged in was, and you can see this, your rock stars are using it with this amount of frequency. I need your help to go out and push that we're going to use this thing and mandate it if you need to. And again, that doesn't come from me. That's the data that goes to the sales leader that they now push down across their teams and or their regions.
And I know you said customer, a slip of a tongue, but really it's not, because your internal leadership are your customers.
They are my customers, right? Yeah. And I call them literally internal customers. I don't call them stakeholders, because I think with stakeholders, I'm now betrothing to them. With customers, we need each other to be successful.
Yeah.
And it's really a relationship and a partnership.
Tell me about the book, Sales Enablement 3.0?
Thanks for that. I appreciate it. Yeah, it was a book that I wrote for a number of reasons. One, for folks that are going into enablement, because I never had a blueprint coming in, and I wanted to be able to share some of the tips, the tricks, and some of the mistakes that I made so other people don't have to do it. The other piece is I literally have included a bunch of templates that I use on a regular basis that are tried and true. Don't go recreate the wheel. If you can go and learn it, go take it. The other piece is I wrote it for the internal ecosystem of how to work with each one of those organizations internally. I'll give you an example. How do you write a charter? What should be inside of your charter? Who should actually validate that charter for you? And when can you say that you literally have a finalized charter that you can go and share out broadly after you've met with all of your internal customers? So the book is an end-to-end about both the art and the science of enablement, but not just how to, but how not to also.
We'll find out in a minute how people can go and find that book, but just a follow-up question there, which is give me a mistake or a set of mistakes that you used to make that you stopped making.
Yeah, early on in my career, and I'll tell you my biggest one, and with full transparency, I'd come in, I'd do my assessment, I'd jump right in and start going because I've seen this work somewhere else, or I talked to my peers and they're using these tools and this is the process. Stop it. Go and ask, have conversations with all the lines of business before you make any changes at all, right? Otherwise, we are giving our internal customers what we think they need versus what they want. And the other piece is, once you have gotten that feedback from them and you've implemented, whether it be a new process or a program or a platform, always come back and be a part of their QBRs. That's the other thing. We need to be a part of the QBR. And I'm not talking about as a scribe in the back of the room. It's we've made all these promises, or we've talked about what we're going to do. Come back on a quarterly basis at those QBRs, give an update of what's happening, what's either increased or decreased based upon what's been put in place, and then say, all right, here's the next piece. The other thing that the biggest mistake that I've learned is early on, I would just kind of roll out things and it felt like it was random and intermittent. Build out, and along with your leaders, whether it be BDR, AE, SE, HR L&D, CSMs, client services, meet with each of them and agree upon, so you're not stepping on top of each other or constantly sending out enablement stuff. Build out an annual enablement calendar and publish it out broadly and publicly. Does two things. One, it shows you've got a roadmap and you've got a plan. But the other thing is, if I'm talking to that leader, they can now plan as they find the soft spots with their folks or where the needs are. They can plan in Q3, this is what we're going to be doing. Or, you know what, you've got a problem with Disco and Qual. We're going to do a workshop in 3 weeks. I need you to be in that thing. So now it helps you to build out that partnership again across all of those lines of business.
Makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. Well, I know we've only got another 4 or so minutes now, so we'll jump right into the rapid fire 5, and then we'll tell folks how to get your book. You ready?
Sure.
All right. First question, what motivates you?
People. I'm a people person at my core. How can I help somebody else's journey? May not be easier, but a little better.
Name a big goal you have right now, and when would you like to accomplish it?
Big goal right now is, man, I've got so many. And that's a tough one. My biggest goal right now literally has nothing to do with enablement. It is watching my son graduate from school this summer.
That's awesome. Love it. What's your most preferred way to learn new information to stay sharp?
Podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts.
Love it. How many hours of sleep do you average per night?
Probably 6.5.
What's your favorite thing to do when you aren't working?
Bocce. Playing bocce ball, to be quite honest. I got a bocce ball court in my backyard. It's relaxing. Plus, no matter how old I get, I don't have to jump over anybody or run around anybody.
jump over
think about something. This is the only true quote unquote sport that I know that actually pushes you to have a cocktail and enhances your play during the game. I'm in.
Sounds like something I need to start doing.
There you go.
My goodness. How can people reach out to you to say thank you and to also find out more about the book or how to get the book?
Absolutely. So from a social media perspective, on LinkedIn, Roderick Jefferson, on both Twitter and Facebook at The Voice of Rod, on Instagram, Roderick_J_associates, or you can go to my company website at roderickjefferson.com. If you want to grab the book, you can go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc., wherever you get paperback, audio, ebooks. It's out there.
And I'll make sure all of that is in the show notes. Charan, make sure that is all in the show notes. That's my producer for sure. Just two more questions. One question, and then I'm going to ask you to think of a question to ask my next guest. So question, describe where you thought you wanted to be when you first started out in your career, and compare and contrast that to where you are now.
Again, I started out in sales. I thought I was going to be a sales leader, and then I'd move up to a district manager, and I'd move up to a VP and all those things. Mm-hmm. And then I quickly realized that I loved the process of selling more than I did taking down big deals. Mm-hmm. And I'll say this, Jay, I have absolutely no regret. It's been an amazing ride thus far with some great, fantastic people, some experiences that you can't print money to be able to enjoy.
Yeah, and you've shared some of those experiences with me offline, so I know exactly what you're talking about for sure. It's
been a magical kind of Disney fairy tale, to be honest.
Yeah, I know. I'm sure it has. We'll have to have you come back on another time to tell the audience about those stories. Believe me, he has plenty of them. What's one question you would like for me to ask my next guest? Will also be.
Man, that's a great question. You know what I would say is, ask the next question. What's the one thing that you didn't want to do that turned out to be one of the best things that you ever did?
It's fantastic. What's the one thing you didn't want to do that turned out to be the best thing you ever did? I'm laughing because for me, it was get married.
Oh, wow. Ooh, that's a whole other podcast within itself.
Yeah, right, exactly. Maybe that's on the QB Dad podcast with Casey Jacobs, who by the way you do as well. But yes, okay, fantastic. I know you have to run, Roderick Jefferson. Thank you again for joining the Goats of Growth.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody. Cue the music. Ooh, hold on. Cue the music.